Episode 1, the first tear. They say a sound can tear heaven open. I didn't believe it until I heard it. It was 3:13 a.m. when the cry shattered the silence in St. Aurelia's chapel. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had snuck in through the side entrance, driven by a guilt I didn't have words for. A priest should never doubt. But that night, I had. The cry wasn't human. It didn't echo, it imploded, like a soul breaking in reverse. And then it came. Thick, warm drops sliding from the glass eyes of every statue in the chapel. The Virgin, Saint Joseph, even the crucifix, all of them weeping blood. I ran, but running doesn't help when the sound follows you inside your chest. The next morning, I returned. The pews smelled of copper and incense. No trace of blood remained, only silence so dense I could hear my thoughts begging me to leave. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination. Exhaustion, stress, a nightmare I brought with me from some deeper place. Then came the child. She arrived during evening mass, unannounced. I still wiped for her face, skin pale like candle wax. She didn't speak. She just stood in the aisle, staring at the altar, and then she cried. One sob, one single, low, inhuman note. The statues bled again. Gasps, screams, prayers. People fled. I frowned. See. She turned toward me and smiled. He listens only when it hurts, she said. That was 7 days ago. Now, every night, I dream of mounds opening in marble, of saints whispering sins they never committed, of God turning his face away in anger. But in grief, I don't know what's happening to this church, but I know what the girl told me next. There's a cry that reaches heaven, because it was never meant to come from earth. And I fear she wasn't just talking about herself. Episode 2, the altar never sleeps. I started keeping the church doors locked at night, not for the living but for whatever watches from behind the saint's glass eyes. 3 nights ago, I found the child again, or maybe she found me. She was sitting in the confessional, on the priest's side. Do you want to confess? I asked her, trying to reclaim the control I felt slipping every hour. She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered something in Latin ancient, broken, and wet with grief. My blood turned to ice. What did you say? She opened the screen slowly, reached her tiny fingers through the grate, and touched my forehead. And in that moment, I saw, not with my eyes, but with something older, a vision smeared with red and smoke, a cathedral burning, statues melting like wax, angels screaming, bound in chains, and at the center of it all, an altar pulsing. Alive, breathing like a wounded beast. I pulled back, gasping, crying. The confessional was empty. She had vanished again, but the scent of myrrh and blood lingered in the air. I reviewed the tapes from the security camera the next morning. The footage skipped at exactly 3:13 a.m., static, and then a single frame. The child standing behind me, eyes black, tears of blood falling upward. I shut the laptop. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night, the altar bled, not the statuesque altar. Deep red lines forming in the wood-like veins. The body of Christ in the tabernacle had turned black. I called the diocese. They told me to rest, that I was under spiritual attack, that this was my burden as a shepherd. But they didn't hear the cry, and they didn't see what was written beneath the altar, carved in a language only the damned remember. The cry that made statues bleed was just the beginning. Episode 3, the eyes of the blessed. The following evening, I removed the veil from every statue in the church. It was a desperate gesture, part ritual, part madness. I needed to see their faces. I needed to know if what I saw before was real, or if I was slowly losing my grip. One by one, their gazes returned my own, cold, hollow, still, until I reached the statue of Saint Cecilia. She was known as the patron saint of music, sculpted here with a delicate smile, and her hands carved mid him. But something had changed. Her head was tilted slightly to the right. I know that statue. I passed it every day for 17 years. It had never tilted. My knees buckled. I whispered, a permy voice, trembling, and reached out to touch her face. Her eyes moved, only a fraction, but enough to turn my breath into a scream. That night, I slept in the vestry, Bible pressed to my chest like a shield. And yet, the dream returned. In it, I stood in the nave, surrounded by rows of faceless saints. They wept blood, but they weren't crying for me. They were crying to me. Their voices flooded my head, thousands of tongues whispering a single word. Remember, I was gasping, soaked in sweat, my throat raw as if I had screamed all night. There was a knock at the chapel door. I opened it, and there she was, child, holding something in her hands. A jar. Inside it, blood, thick, congealed, still warm. He said, "This is the first vial." She said, "Of what?" I asked, nearly dropping the jar. She looked past me, into the dark sanctuary, and whispered, "The proof that heaven bled once, and it remembers how." Episode 4, The Choir with No Mouths. Last night, I opened the jar. I don't know why I did. A curiosity, maybe, or defiance, or something darker, something older that had begun whispering to me since the first cry. The blood inside was warm, pulsing faintly like a second heartbeat. I dipped a cloth into it, intending to seal it again, but the second the blood touched the air, the choir began. It wasn't music. It wasn't human. It was a mourning, 100 voices gasping in unison, as if choking on the memory of God. I dropped the jar. It didn't shatter. It sank slowly into the chapel floor as if the stone were soft, like the earth wanted it back. And when it was gone, every candle in the church lit itself. No matches, no wind, just sudden fire. And then the statues turned. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean they turned. Each one virgin, apostles, martyrs facing toward the altar, no longer in passive prayer, no longer blind, their faces twisted not with rage, but with pleading, as if begging something or someone not to rise. That was when I heard the sound again, but this time, it came not from the statues or the child. It came from beneath the floor, a grillo, guttural, but unmistakably holy in its despair, as if heaven itself had been buried alive and was clawing to be heard. I dropped to my knees. "What do you want from me?" I shouted into the stone. No answer, only the candles flickering violently in reply. Later, that child returned. Her mouth was stitched shut, black thread, crude, fresh. She handed me a parchment soaked in wax. I unrolled it with trembling hands. There, written in blood, "He is almost awake. Prepare the hymn." I looked at her in horror as she nodded, and then pointed to the organ loft, where no one had played in 20 years, where the keys began pressing down one by invisible hands. Episode 5, The Hymn of the Unborn. The organ played through the night. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Each note struck like a confession I had made. Each chord pulled something from me, piece by piece, as though I were being unstitched from within. I climbed the stairs to the loft at dawn. The organ was still echoing, even though no one Saturday at the bench. Keys moved on their own, but not randomly. The notes followed a structure, a ritual. I recognized fragments of forgotten hymns, buried verses from banned liturgies. Then I saw the child again, not standing, not walking, kneeling at the base of the pipes, her stitched mouth trembling. Blood leaked slowly from the corners like a warning. She lifted her hand and pointed to the stained glass window above the organ, a window I had never paid attention to until the light shifted. The glass depicted the birth of Christ, but now, beneath the Virgin's feet, something new had appeared, a shadow, coped, crowned, with a mouth like a screaming wound. The light bled red through it. The air turned heavy. I gasped, and then the child reached for a single key on the organ. She pressed it. The church cracked. The walls groaned, as if remembering every sin confessed within them. I felt something awaken beneath my feet, deeper than the crypt, older than the foundation. Then came the whisper, not from the child, from the pipes. "Sin, or he will." I fell back, gripping my collar. My faith had never felt so fragile. That evening, I searched through ancient hymnals in the sacristy. Many had been sealed by the Vatican verses deemed too dangerous, too raw. I found one written in blood, pressed between pages of dried lilies. No title, just a first line. "Blessed are the wombs that never bore." My hands trembled as I read it aloud. From the shadows behind me, that child wept, and the statues began to sing. Episode 6, Where the Cross Was Buried. I buried the hymn beneath the chapel floor, not out of fear, out of instinct. As soon as I had finished reading it, the earth beneath the altar moaned, not like rock shifting, but like something wounded being disturbed. And then came the smell, iron, ash, and milk. I didn't question it. I burned the page and wrapped the ashes in linen, dug a shallow grave beneath the crucifix, where the old stone floor had cracked years ago but was never repaired. But the fire didn't kill them. That night, I found it rewritten on the chapel walls, not in ink, not in blood, in tears. The child was standing in the corner. I saw, hands clasped. She didn't speak. She radiated, and behind her, the crucifix was missing, gone, ripped clean off the wall. Only the shadow of Christ remained burned into the stone. I fell to my knees. The chapel began to hum, low and steady, like a mother rocking a coffin. And then I heard it, the voice of someone praying beneath the ground. Male, ancient, broken, not in Latin, not in any language I recognized but I understood. Forgive the day we hid the body. Forgive the silence we called sacred. Forgive the miracle that never bled enough. The girl approached, in her hand, a nail, old, bent, still wet. She placed it in my palm and whispered it with her mouth. But from somewhere deeper, the cry was not from sorrow. It was from resurrection denied. I stared at the floor, at the place where the cross had once hung, and I realized what them had awakened wasn't trying to return. It was trying to remember who buried it in the first place. Episode 7, The Saint Who Screamed. The statue of St. Jude shattered at exactly 3:13 a.m. Not from age, not from accident. From within, it split open like a ribcage. And inside, where stone should have been solid, there was flesh, pulsing, rotten, breathing. I stood before it, stunned, clutching the nail the girl had given me. The wound inside the statue moved, like lone stitched with psalms, and then it screamed, not with sound, with memory, my childhood, my first sin, my first lying confession, my mother's funeral, my ordination, all of it stripped from me, replayed in reverse. St. Jude's patron of lost cause was now the shrine of forgotten guilt. The girl appeared in the doorway. She had no shadow. She walked barefoot through the shattered marble and held out her hands. In one palm, a feather, in the other, a tooth. One belonged to a seraph, she said, the other to the first priest who tried to silence the cry. I asked her which was which. She just closed her hands, and behind her, the remaining statues began to whisper. Their mouths didn't move, but I heard them inside me. He is no longer sleeping. He remembers the hymns they buried. He knows the names of every tongue that stayed silent. I dropped to my knees, my own mouth open against my will, and I sang. The words weren't mine. They were old, acidic, too white for a human throat, but I sang until my voice bled. When I stopped, the girl placed the feather and tooth at the base of the altar. Tomorrow, she said, he will ask you to choose. Choose what? I whispered. She looked toward the tabernacle, where the blackened host still pulsed faintly, which one to keep and which one to worship. Episode 8, The Cry Beneath the Chalice. The choice came with no voice. At dawn, the tabernacle burst open by itself. The blackened host inside had crumbled into ash, but beneath it something waited. Not gold, not relic, but a heart, a real one, still beating. I staggered back. My hands trembled, yet someone forced me closer. My breath fogged the inside of my collar. My lips murmured verses I didn't know I remembered. The girl was already kneeling. She reached forward and touched the heart. It didn't recoil. It responded, a low pulse that echoed through the pews, like a drum marking the steps of something rising from below. This is not his heart, she said. It's the one they gave him. I stared at her. The words brittle in my throat. Gave who? She looked at the ceiling, got the crucifix empty shadow. The cry didn't come from his mouth. It came from the wound they made before the nails. Suddenly, the chalice on the altar cracked. Wine spilled, but it wasn't wine. It was milk, thick, sour, and inside it, teeth. Baby teeth. Hundreds. I nearly vomited. The statues bled again, but this time from their ears. And I could hear it to sound that made them weep. A lullaby. Twisted, low, sung in reverse. And beneath the altar, something answered. 3 knocks. He remembers the betrayal before the kiss. The girl whispered. The heart on the altar pulsed once more, and then it spoken it aloud, but into the marrow of my bones. Before I rise, the last shepherd must descend. I think that meant me. Episode 9, The Descent. I opened the trapdoor beneath the altar. No one ever told me it was there. It wasn't on the blueprints. It hadn't been part of the old chapel restoration, but it was there now, carved perfectly, pulsing slightly, as if it had grown like a scab ready to tear. The girl stood beside me, barefoot on cold stone, her stitched lips trembling as though they longed to scream. I descended with nothing but a candle. The steps curved in ways no architecture should. They were damp, veined, and warm to the touch. The walls breathed. I felt like I was being swallowed. After what felt like hours, I reached the bottom, a chamber, circular, silent. In the center, a cradle made of bone. Inside it lay the crucifix that had vanished from the wall above. But it was different now. Twisted, the Christ upon it was not the Christ I had worshipped. His eyes were open, weeping, alive. But what broke me was what surrounded the cradle. Hundreds of priest collars, blood-soaked, folded neatly in circles like a ritual. There posed with prayer but not holy. It was a prayer made from regret. The girl placed her hand on the cradle. Every shepherd who heard the cry was brought here, she said. And what happened to them? I asked, though I already knew. She didn't answer. Instead, the Christ on the cradle turned his head toward me, and in a voice that sounded like every confession I'd ever heard whispered in unison, he said, "Will you carry me this time, or bury me again?" The walls bled, and the cradle rocked. Episode 10, The Shepherd's Wound. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. The question still rings in my chest. Will you carry me this time, or bury me again? I knelt beside the cradle of bone, trembling. My hands hovered above the twisted Christ, his body shifting between flesh and icon, grief and rage. The girl touched my shoulder. "Your silence is the cry," she said, and then she vanished. No footsteps, no sound, just gone, like breath held too long. The chamber began to shake, not violently but rhythmically, a heartbeat from below, deeper than the earth should go. And then, the voices began again, the same ones that had whispered through walls, candles, and marble. But now, they sang my name. Every syllable cracked like a bone. I stumbled to my feet and turned. The walls had changed. They now bore images, murals in living flesh, each one depicting moments from my life, shameful, hidden, unforgiven. Me, as a boy, stealing from my father's drawer. Me, turning away from a friend's suicide note. Me, standing over the altar, doubting the presence I'd just consecrate. Each image breathed, each wound wept, and then, beneath it all, a final mural. Me, standing in this very chamber, holding the twisted Chris eyes black, smile bleeding. I turned away, horrified, but the cradle was empty. I spun back around and saw him standing, not hanging, not nailed, standing. Christ, or what remained of him, stepped toward me, eyes locked, sorrow endless. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out was mine, crying as if the scream I'd heard all those nights ago was not from him but from the part of myself I buried every time I put on the collar. The truth is this: I am the wound. I always was, and he remembers. Episode 11, The Room Without a Heaven. I tried to climb back up, but the staircase that had brought me down no longer existed. The air had thickened. My lungs ached, not for oxygen but for faith. The chamber had grown wider. The walls now pulsed like lungs, exhaling warm gusts of incense and rot. The twisted Christ still stood before me, unmoving now, a monument to something long exiled from grace. Then I heard it, laughter, not cruel, not mocking, wounded, like a mother burying a child who never lived. And there she was, girl, but she was no longer a girl. Her stitches had split, her eyes were black, her hands dripped wax and milk. She pointed to a new door that had appeared in the flesh wall beside me, carved in bone, breathing. In there, she whispered, voice full of grief and command. "What is it?" I asked. Her answer chilled my soul. The room where prayers were forgotten by heaven. I opened the door. Inside, candles floated in midair, suspended in circles. In the center was a child's cradle, empty, but crying. The sound cried, the same one that had started all of this. It was coming from nothing. A cry with no throat, no lungs, no origin, and yet it tore at the room like claws across stained glass. And then the walls began to write, words scrawled in ash and breath. This is the cry God did not answer, and so it made itself heard. I fell to my knees. Tears burned, My collar strangled me. My faith snapped like brittle pages. The girl entered behind me and held my hand. You were never meant to silence it, she whispered. You were meant to listen. The cry grew louder, and somewhere deep inside me, I began to remember what I'd buried long before I became a priest. A cry I made once, and no one answered. Episode 12, the answer God couldn't give. The crying didn't stop. It became everything. The walls, the floor, my blood. It echoed from every fiber of this place, beneath the altar, beneath the cradle, beneath the silence of a heaven that turned away. I knelt beside the empty cradle, and the girl, no longer human, stood behind me like a priest at my last confession. She placed her hand on my back. It burned, but not from fire, from memory. You must give it a name, she said. What? Every cry that is heard becomes something holy. But this one was never named. That's why it returned. I wept. My lips trembled. And then I whispered it, not aloud, not even with sound. I named it after myself. The room pulsed. The candles spun faster. The walls cracked upward, bleeding gold. The cradle filled, not with flesh, but with light. Pure, weeping light, full of every prayer never finished, every scream never held. And then, silence. The twisted Christ reappeared beside me. Oh no, not beautiful, not divine, real. He knelt too, and he wept. The girl what remained of her smile one last time, her body turning to wax, melting slowly into the floor. And then a voice in it is, not hers, but mine, filled the chamber. If heaven would not answer, then I must. The wound inside me closed, not because it was healed, but because it had been heard.